Если кем-то принято решение уничтожить Россию, тогда у нас возникает законное право ответить. Для мира будет глобальная катастрофа. Но я все-таки как гражданин России и глава российского государства тогда хочу задаться вопросом, а зачем нам такой мир, если там не будет России? Советский Союз был союзником Соединенных Штатов, но нас никто в известность даже об этом не поставил. Да и необходимости, как многие эксперты считают, не было никакой. Штаты это сделали.
They say the problem with making too many enemies is that one day your enemies might become friends. It's January 2024. Somewhere above the grey skies of Ukraine, a missile cuts through the night. One of hundreds Russia fired in its largest air assault since the war began. But when the fragments hit the frozen ground, something didn't add up. The missile wasn't Russian-made. The markings, the alloy, the internal guidance chip, all matched a different origin. North Korea, what investigators discovered next, would reshape modern warfare. Satellite imagery confirmed that in the months leading up to the strike, North Korea had shipped over 11,000 containers of weapons to Russia by train. But Pyongyang wasn't the only silent partner. The drones that buzzed over Ukrainian cities bore the unmistakable fingerprint of Iranian design. Shahed-type kamikaze UAVs manufactured in underground facilities and launched from Russian soil, and the sleek turbojet engines driving Russia's new cruise missiles made in China. Suddenly, the pattern became impossible to ignore. 4 nations, Russia, Iran, China and North Korea, all feeding each other's wars, all sanctioned, all isolated, all burning for relevance. In Washington, analysts started calling it AICS, the new Axis, a name that echoed across intelligence briefings like a ghost from history. The term evoked the alliances of World War II, a rebirth of the old Axis powers, but this time fused with the machinery of the digital age. Data, drones, cyber warfare, and disinformation. For years, the US had fought enemies one by one. Now, it was facing something far more dangerous. A coalition of outcasts who had learned to survive under sanctions, to trade outside the dollar, and to weaponize dependency itself. What had once been 4 disconnected regimes, an autocracy, a theocracy, a communist state, and a socialist dictatorship, were beginning to orbit each other like planets aligning for an eclipse. To understand how this shadow alliance came to life, you have to look at what unites them and what each of them fears. Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea couldn't be more different on paper. One is an empire reborn from the ashes of the Soviet Union. Another, a theocratic state wrapped in ideology. A third, a one-party superpower that turned capitalism into an instrument of control. And the fourth, a closed-off monarchy masquerading as socialism. Yet together they form a new geometry of defiance, a coalition defined not by trust, but by necessity. For Russia, everything began with loss, the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the red flag fell over the Kremlin, Moscow lost half its territory, millions of its people, and nearly all of its influence. For Vladimir Putin, it was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. His mission ever since has been restoration, to pull back what he believes was stolen, piece by piece, whether through force, manipulation, or fear. Ukraine was just the latest frontier, not the last. Iran's story runs parallel, though its motives burn with religion instead of empire. Guided by clerics and the dream of an Islamic order, Iran seeks to dominate the Middle East, to erase Israel, to weaken Saudi Arabia, and to expand its influence from Lebanon to Yemen. Every missile launch, every drone strike, every proxy militia it funds is a line in that same ancient script, a crusade cloaked in modern warfare. North Korea's path is one of isolation. It's a dynasty born from division, a nation that has turned paranoia into policy. Since the 1950s, it has existed in defiance of the modern world, pouring every ounce of its resources into building the ultimate deterrent: nuclear weapons. The regime survives through fear, both inside and out. For Kim Jong-un, the world beyond the 38th parallel is not a partner, but a threat. Yet even he saw the advantage of joining a circle where sanctions could be turned into barter and weakness into leverage. And then there is China, the quiet architect behind much of this realignment. The Communist Party learned what the Soviets never could: control the market, and you control the people. By mastering capitalism instead of rejecting it, Beijing built the world's second largest economy and a modern army to protect it. But beneath its glittering cities lies the same obsession that has haunted it for decades: Taiwan. The island represents unfinished business, a living reminder that China's revolution is incomplete. These four regimes, one wounded, one zealot, one isolated, one calculating, share the same enemy: the West, and above all, the United States. For decades, Washington's dominance wasn't just military, it was financial, cultural, and technological. The dollar was the world's bloodstream, the internet its nervous system. The problem for the Axis is that both were American inventions. When the US sanctions Russia, it bleeds Iran. When it punishes North Korea, it pressures China. The system is rigged, they argue, a global order where one country writes the rules and everyone else plays by them. So they stopped playing. Instead, they started trading: weapons for oil, oil for chips, chips for food, creating their own circuits of survival. What began as desperation evolved into a plan to create a new world where power no longer flows through Washington or Wall Street. And if the West was paying attention, it might have noticed the shift too late. Because while America was busy watching borders, this alliance was redrawing maps. By the time Western analysts began connecting the dots, the network had already matured. It wasn't born in a treaty room or on a battlefield. It emerged quietly from necessity. Russia, cut off from the global financial system after invading Ukraine, needed weapons and spare parts. Iran, isolated for decades, saw an opportunity to sell its drones and test its war industry on live battlefields. North Korea, desperate for fuel and hard currency, traded shells for oil. And China, the silent giant, provided the logistics, the chips, the currency lifeline, all while pretending to stand at a distance. Each nation filled the other's void. What Moscow lost in Western technology, Beijing replaced with dual-use electronics. What Pyongyang couldn't buy, Tehran smuggled, and what Iran couldn't transport, Russia routed through the Caspian corridor, a vast shadow network of freight lines, oil tankers, and encrypted payment systems. Behind the scenes, Russian oligarchs used Dubai shell companies and Chinese banks in Macau to settle debts, while North Korean laborers built secret infrastructure projects in Siberia under fake construction contracts. By 2024, this system had become something the West could neither sanction nor see. Meanwhile, propaganda machines in Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing began echoing the same message: that the Western order was dying. Chinese state TV aired documentaries calling America an empire in decline. Russian talk shows mocked NATO as a relic of the 20th century. Iranian clerics praised the resistance economy. And through it all, the new Axis learned to wage a new kind of war, not with armies, but with narratives. In the shadows of cyberspace, Chinese data brokers sold access to surveillance systems. Russian hackers attacked European power grids. Iranian influence accounts posed as Western journalists, flooding social media with chaos. Together, they tested the boundaries of a world held together by digital threads. But the real genius of this alliance wasn't military, it was psychological. By combining economic survival tactics with propaganda and cyber warfare, they built an ecosystem of interdependence. Each regime could fall alone, but together they formed a self-sustaining bloc, an empire of necessity. Behind closed doors, Western intelligence began using a different term: resilient authoritarianism. It described how these nations learned from every sanction, every hack, every missile test. They had adapted faster than the democracies trying to contain them. And while Western nations debated ethics and policy, the new Axis built factories, trained engineers, and mined rare earth metals, a silent industrial revolution unfolding under the cover of defiance. By 2025, the pattern was unmistakable. The old world order, once led by the US, enforced by NATO, and powered by global capitalism, was fracturing. The new Axis didn't need to conquer it. They only needed to let it decay. In Beijing, quiet deals replaced open trade. The yuan began appearing in African oil contracts, replacing the dollar one signature at a time. In Tehran, drone factories multiplied underground, exporting to Yemen, Sudan, and Syria. In Pyongyang, long-range missile tests resumed, each one more accurate than the last. And in Moscow, Putin's ministers openly discussed a post-Western world where energy, information, and warfare would flow through alternate circuits of power. Yet the most unsettling battlefield wasn't physical, it was digital. AI-generated propaganda blurred the line between fact and fiction. Western voters saw foreign-made deepfakes in their own elections. Data leaks became weapons. Algorithms became spies. The new Axis didn't just challenge the balance of power, it redefined what power meant. No longer about territory, power now meant control over perception. Whoever could shape reality fastest won. And as this silent war spread, something remarkable happened. Smaller nations began choosing sides. From Africa to South America, governments once dependent on Washington started trading with Beijing and Moscow instead. The West's moral authority eroded under the weight of its own contradictions. In the end, the new Axis didn't need tanks in Paris or missiles in New York. All they needed was time and the willingness to exploit every fracture in the modern world. Because the greatest threat to Western power was never invasion. It was irrelevance.